I'm Mary Greendale, and welcome to another edition of Just Thinking. And believe it or not, it's been 3 months since State Representative-Carolyn Dykema joined me for a show, and here we are, and a quarter of a year later, back again. Carolyn, I'm happy to see you. How are you?
I'm very well. It went fast. It seems like we were just here. It's good
I know,
to be back.
and that's one of the horrifying things about life.
Getting old, yes.
I don't know if it's old, age, whatever, but it's just, it goes so fast. I wanted to start with one thing. You sent out a newsletter not too long ago via email.
Right.
And it was a sequel to Gone with the Wind. I mean, it was almost that long.
There's a lot going on.
There is a lot going on, and for government geeks like me, it's fabulous. You know, I get to know what's going on.
Great.
But at any rate, I want to make sure, how do people get that? If you aren't already on the mailing list, how do you get on your mailing list?
So there is I believe there's a subscription tab at the bottom of the email, and if people would just send an email to my State House email, we'll go ahead and put you on. It's also available on my Facebook page. I tend to get a lot of information out via Facebook, and we always post the link to the newsletter on there.
Okay.
So that's probably an easy
way to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's a great newsletter, and you certainly covered a whole lot of things, including things that I was personally concerned about.
Well, you know, it's funny, when I first ran for this position, one of my goals and one of the things that I promised to folks is that I would stay in touch, and I would really, you know, let people know and keep them connected to the State House, and this is another great opportunity to do that. So
yeah, no, it is, and it also you can read it at your leisure, because reading it all at once is overwhelming. You know, I read how many different committees you're on and activities you're involved in and so forth, and I have to wonder if they've given up sleep permanently, or is this just temporary?
Well, it's funny, because I've asked people, you know, is it too much? Is it too long? You know, tell me. Because I could do sort of shorter things, and people really like the additional information. They sort of read what they're interested in, and they don't read what they're not interested in, and they appreciate the details. So,
absolutely.
And I appreciate the feedback. So anyone who takes a look at the newsletter and has thoughts or suggestions, I'm always welcome to them.
No, I think you've done it well. There's enough information in it, but if you want more, you can go to the web links and other things that you provide in there. So there were a lot of things I wanted to ask you about. Can I be selfish and just ask you about one little one that doesn't fit into your newsletter, and that is the issue about the in-home care for people who are at home. We now have a family member who's at home with 24-hour care. I did not realize that the associations, agencies, whatever you want to call them, that come in and provide that care are not certified. They are not in any way inspected, examined. They don't have any credentials or whatever, which means that I could open up my own business tomorrow and become a home care provider, and that's not anything anybody would want. So, you know, how is that? Why is that?
And it's an issue that affects so many
Oh my God,
people.
yes.
You know, it seems like almost everyone I know has had a need to care for, you know, a parent or a relative, and have folks come in and help to keep them in their home. And it's such an essential role, so that, you know, people just want to be in their homes and be comfortable. But so there are requirements for services that are supported by Medicare and Medicaid, so it's not like there are no requirements at all. It's really just those
It's the private pay
services that are a loophole, frankly. And there has been a piece of legislation filed. Representative Denise Garlick, who is a nurse herself, who appreciates these issues from kind of a frontline perspective, filed something that would provide for licensing and would also provide a home care registry.
Good.
So that if you were, you know, looking for someone to come into your home and wanted to just make sure that they had been, you know, that they were okay and there was no background issue there. So the bill did not advance, but we did end up creating a home care registry. So that's in process right now. I think they're looking for public comment here soon.
Okay, I'll look that up, because I have comments.
Oh, good. Okay.
Really, I was appalled when I realized it, because it's the VNA was the one that was reporting to me, and it was like, really? So once we stop with the VNA, which is a Medicare-supported agency, once we stop with that, then we move into the dark, you know, realm of who are you people? But anyway, okay, let's go with your biggie, and that was transportation. Yeah, wow, a whole lot in that. So you're on the Transportation Committee?
I'm the Vice Chair of the Transportation Committee for just the last year, and it's been, you know, a big learning curve on a whole lot of issues. I will say that transportation has been an issue in this district for a long time.
And why would that be, Carol?
Why would that be? So, it's funny. So we work as a member of a caucus, a legislative caucus, which is Metro West legislators. And so the goal is to come together and work on issues that affect us regionally, not just our own home districts. And I was surprised when I first came in that effectively the Metro West Legislators Caucus is the Metro West Transportation Caucus, because that is all we talk about, whether it be tolls or public transit. Tolls have been a big one in the past.
Yeah, sure.
So I've really gotten involved in this transit issue and supporting public transit, largely starting because constituents would reach out. Anyone who is watching who takes the commuter rail in the morning knows that we've got, we don't have a 21st century system. We were one of the first in the nation to have a transit system, which was exciting, but unfortunately we haven't been able to keep up with it. And a lot of that has been Big Dig related. Back for those that remember the Big Dig, a lot of our federal transportation money, which is where we get a lot of our funding for transportation, ended up being sort of co-opted for Big Dig financing, which ended up being over budget. So all of that funding that normally would have been put into maintenance and repair for both transit and road repair, bridge repair, was not available for a long time. So we're really, having to catch up with all that maintenance that we didn't do.
The irony there is that because of the Big Dig, we drove growth. And so then as we drove growth in business and the economy grew, then we attracted more people. But to be able to live, they had to commute from farther distances. So, it's like we made it all worse in terms of, one good deed and a couple of not so good ones.
Well, the two other things that I think are important now, one is the congestion issue. I can't go anywhere without, to your point about growth, the traffic on the roads, I don't care what road it is, whether it's the major, the Pike or all of the roads that people use if it's busy on the Pike to reroute. And the climate issue, which I know is something that
we need to talk
going to be talking about. But if you're concerned about climate, and I know pretty much everyone is, then our automobiles and trucks are the largest contributor to greenhouse gas here in Massachusetts. So if we're going to be serious about climate, we have to get cars off the roads. And of course, transit is the most obvious option there. So that's really where I've been focusing my efforts on transit. And commuter rail in particular for our region.
Oh, yeah. I used to live on it. I loved it. But this was a long time ago when it really was not as crowded, the demand was different. The trains were newer, all of that.
So we need to do better. We need to think about things like parking. And I'm part of a statewide vision study group, which is looking kind of a long-term investment. Are we going to invest in something like electrification for our commuter rail trains, which would be faster, probably more reliable, and as well as dealing with the climate issue. So there's a lot to come on that front. We've really just started. We're in the planning phase, and at some point we're going to have a conversation about, if, how, when are we going to pay for these improvements that we know we need. It's not really a question of if we need them. We know we need them. It's whether we're going to be serious about finding a way to pay for them.
Well, and the thing is, what if we don't? Where does if we don't do it, there's nothing to nothing's going to get better. It's only going to get worse.
Right.
It's not going to stay the same. So, there's really, it seems to me like one of those, you have to fix it.
Yeah.
Is there conversation about a monorail on the Turnpike?
No.
That one goes back to the 70s.
I remember hearing it. May have even been you that told me about that many years ago. But
I liked that one, It was going to stop in Westboro right at the computer triangle that's there, where you have all the computer drive, and then where at that time it was Data General. That would have been in the 80s. So, it was good. Yeah.
Well,
anyway.
one of the things that is important for folks in our area to know is about this new viaduct, the Alston-Brighton Viaduct project, which is the reconstruction of the area by BU on the Mass Pike.
Okay.
And it affects both the Pike reconstruction as well as the commuter rail, which runs just adjacent to that.
Okay.
So Harvard University and a lot of the Longwood medical folks are going to be redeveloping the old rail yards that were in that area, and it's exciting new economic opportunity for us here in Massachusetts, but also going to create some real headaches for us out here in Metro West because that area is going to be limited, closed down,
for some period,
limited number of lanes for actually a significant period of time. Yeah. It's a major project. So part of the advocacy on the transit piece is how can we make sure that our Metro West needs here are accounted for in that conversation, and that we've got mitigation so that folks can still get to and from work when they need to.
Does that access, is that the one that goes to Cambridge too? Would it actually improve access to Cambridge or not?
Well, that's part of the conversation they call the Grand Junction.
Okay.
So it would.
I love all the names.
Yes, and it's hard to keep them all straight, but that would allow, as part of the same project, there's a conversation about allowing access across the river via transit, which would be really helpful for people.
Oh God, can you imagine?
But
you can't get to Cambridge from here.
No, you can't. But there are a lot of considerations. Rail crossings would impact traffic flow in Cambridge. So needless to say, it's not a short conversation, long conversation. But we have a very real and active presence through a number of legislators in our area.
Is there anything that the public can do?
At this point, I would say, just stay tuned, watch the newspaper. There's an occasional article about it. If people have specific concerns, please reach out. Make sure that we are aware of them so that we can feed them into the conversation.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so let's move to the clean air. So we've introduced ourselves to it with the smokestacks of exhaust fumes from cars and trucks. What do we need to know there?
Well, you're probably aware of the new report that just came out. The federal government issued a report that was quite striking in its... the one that came out right after Thanksgiving, right.
The day after Thanksgiving.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Pretty dramatic concerns here, which we knew about, but I think this new report released it in a fairly dramatic and federal way.
Who did the report?
It was a government agency. I don't remember exactly who did it, but it has weight in the conversation, certainly, and the folks that did it were experts in the field, and I think there's a lot of consensus around the reports there, which, for our region, it highlighted some of the impacts to our region.
We were going to be hurt more than one that we expected, or two than most.
A lot of water impacts.
Yeah.
Which is something that I've been working on for a while. We've got coastal impacts, which I think people know about, but other things like some of the stormwater, some of these rain events that we're going to be dealing with. I mean, that affects communities like Holliston, our dams, our stormwater management, get the stormwater off the roads. Those are all things that we're going to need to address. And, we need to have plans to be thinking long term and to start kind of chipping away at some of those issues that we know don't address the underlying issue around emissions, which we need to be addressing through things like transit, but just simply, how are we going to address the impacts of having an 100-year storm, which used
every
to be
10
one
years,
right,
or
exactly.
every year,
no,
or
every multiple times in a 10-year.
Yeah.
Time frame.
I know I did an article for Holliston Reporter not too long ago about the 2005 storm, in which the dam almost went. It was just so full. But the flood at Houghton's Pond, which is behind
Dunkin' Donuts.
And Dunkin' Donuts septic tank just floating there, and a car up to its, to the passenger window, up to the windows in water and stuff. I think one of the things that would help the public is to understand what is stormwater. We talk about stormwater. So when all of that water's been sloshing around on the streets and the sidewalks and coming out of the pond where ducks and geese and whatever live, all of that is going down our drains or being soaked into the ground, and then goes to our aquifer, I assume, eventually.
Well, one of the issues is with these intense rain events that we're getting now, it should go to the aquifer, which replenishes our drinking water supply, where we've got public drinking water wells. With these intense stormwater events, it all tends to run off. And because it's such a high volume, it goes directly into surface water, like into our ponds and our lakes. And the concern there was stormwater, Charles River, and any water body that takes water, it just, you get the runoff, which means that all of the contaminants, whether that be, things from the roadway or any kind of things that we use on our lawns, all just washes directly into our water bodies and is affecting them. You see things like algae, significant algae growth, which in some cases can be a public health issue. The other real concern, though, when you think about stormwater, is the replenishment of our aquifer. How are we going to make sure that this water doesn't just run off and kind of circumvent flowing back into our groundwater, but actually try to redirect it into our groundwater? So that's why the federal government recently put in new stormwater requirements that are now in effect for our cities and towns. that municipal folks are rightly concerned about how we're going to pay for these things, which we need to work on. But it is really a very important issue, and stormwater is right now the most significant contributor to the pollution in our lakes and ponds in Charles River now.
Okay, so I have what do you call it? If I have a polluted pond, okay, what's the risk? What's the risk here? Weston Pond becomes polluted with God only knows what.
Yeah, I mean, it's a recreational area or a recreational concern. Obviously, you've got these algae blooms, or you've got, the fish are impacted and you can't fish in Lake Winthrop, for example. And anytime, when I think about that, I think about ecosystems at large. You don't appreciate, I think, if you lose fish in a place like Lake Winthrop, what does that happen to the birds or to other things that feed on the fish? And it really is this kind of bigger environmental concern. Not to mention that at the end of the day, all water kind of,
just circles around.
Circles around. So if you have contamination in one place, it's eventually going to likely end up in your tap. And we all should be concerned from a public health perspective on that.
So we have a question that just came to us on the Facebook page. We're going to veer off just for a second. Is there anything, what is the House doing to protect community media like us from the FCC's threat to cut funding? And is there anything you really can do?
I mean, we can advocate. It's mostly done through the federal government. So we, advocate through our congressional delegation, and certainly the concerns that we we feed up to them to advocate. And there are, local bills to address things that we can address here locally, but it's mostly just kind of keeping the drumbeat going. Let the federal folks, as they debate, know that this is a real priority and that shows like this really add value to the communities that they serve. When
will the decisions, ultimately, when will FCC's actions take effect?
Yeah, I have to confess that I'm not completely up on that.
Yeah.
I don't know that I could.
I think that would be something that
maybe
we'll
we
check
can
on that.
Bring somebody or get up to speed on that and do another show on that.
Yeah. Yeah, because the risk isn't just, obviously you lose the programming and that kind of thing, but it is one of the few news media that remain intact for a local community. It's it's just the Holliston Reporter. You know what I mean? Really, and the Holliston Reporter is a volunteer effort, and basically, how long is that going to happen? So anyway, okay. So let's bounce back to the clean air, clean water, and that whole issue. As we're talking, some of this stuff, we get used to our government language of things, and I'm wondering, are there materials that have been prepared that are really pretty basic, that maybe even get down to a 7th or 8th grade level, that just talks about all of this, how the water comes, it rains and then it goes here and that whole scientific piece, and then you've got the whole piece about stormwater, because stormwater, I think it's one of those mysterious words that people they hear it and it's like, stormwater.
They don't connect what it really means to them.
What does it mean? And I'll tell you the day that it drove home, this was so long ago, but anyway, Ann McCobb, bless her, when she was the health agent down at the Board of Health, they would have to test the lake every day in the summer to make sure that there wasn't a bacteria count in there that was going to prevent kids from using the pond. And she just would have a hissy fit when it was going to rain, because as soon as it rains, everything that's on the shore, including the geese,
so you get a high bacterial count.
You get a high bacterial count. So everybody then panics that, oh my God, the lake is just contaminated. And well, yes and no. Yes and no. But understand that anything that's on the lake, so what you're doing on your front lawn or back lawn, that matters. What you just threw in you had half a cup of whatever left over when you were cleaning your paintbrushes and you just tossed it outside. All of that is getting washed. Stormwater is just cleaning it all off. We're going to clean off all the grass and the debris and everything. Let's dump it in the water. Just trying to get people to understand that every single thing that you do has an implication.
Right. So one of the things that really stuck with me, to your point about, kind of bringing it home for people, there's a book called The Big Thirst. And it's all about water. And one of the quotes in there is that it says, every drop of water on the planet has been around since the age of the dinosaurs. And when you think about that and the implications of keeping it clean, because it's the ultimate recycled resource, it's got to last a lot longer, too, and you really need to think about what we're putting into it. And I think that really underscores the conversation around stormwater.
God. So when I put the water in my gin, it's like, wow.
That's some old water, yeah.
It's very old water, and I'm cleaning it up with the alcohol. But anyway, one of the things in your newsletter that I was really interested in was this Mass Compare about the nursing home, healthcare options and stuff. Where did this come from?
That came out of some legislation that required that to happen to kind of add some transparency to this healthcare conversation. We're asking folks to make smart choices about healthcare, and people want to make smart choices to kind of match up the plans that they need with their actual needs, and it's very hard to do that. You don't know the price of your healthcare until you get the bill, right? So you can't, as a consumer, really make good choices. And it's hard to assess quality as well. There's a lot of question about or differences between our community hospitals, which provide, like Milford Regional and Framingham, that provide services in our local communities, versus a lot of the larger Boston hospitals, which tend to have, in marketing speak, sort of brand recognition. But if you look at the costs and the quality, which the state has started to do, you see that you could have exactly the same service provided, exactly the same outcome, but the cost is much lower provided in our community health settings. But a lot of people go to Boston because they like whatever, they're more comfortable going into Boston. So how can we kind of allow consumers to choose based on actual data rather than kind of these perceptions about where healthcare is offered? And so that's what this website starts to get to. I will say that there's a lot of work still to be done there. I don't think the level of detail is what anyone would hope to have, but it's a great first start. And it can really help people think about what they should be considering when they're making healthcare choices about where they go.
Well, I'll tell you, the hard thing is that none of us makes choices in a timely manner. I mean, sometimes it's when,
you're in a crisis situation,
we got a crisis here, now what do we do, kind of thing. And boy, it's really hard in those circumstances. Now, the other thing, there was a see-through. That was another transparency thing. This was being put through by the whatever office, treasurer's office, maybe? No.
It's the dashboard, right?
Yes.
It's got all kinds of great information.
So it's the transparency on state government. So you can actually find what bargaining units have negotiated.
Any kind of financial information that you would want is really available on there. And a lot of people wonder about why decisions are made or public records or things like that. There's a lot more information out there than people appreciate, and this is an effort to put it into an organized fashion so that people can actually access it. And I think it's really a government trust issue too, to know that information is there and that people are watching out for the dollars and cents.
No, I'm excited because that sounds like something I'd like poring over. We have the little one here in Holliston. Yeah, I know. Wow. We have the one here in Holliston that we signed on for that does the same thing with finance. I mean, it breaks down what everything is, but I'm not sure it's as deep as what you suggest this.
And this is an ongoing, process. There's been sort of different approaches to this, but this is the most recent iteration, and I think definitely adds more than was available before.
That's
so
super.
I encourage people to get in there, and back to the newsletter. If people are interested, we can get them the newsletter, and the link is right in there.
Yeah, no, seriously, that's a really that's an astonishing breakthrough in a way. That government is actually making the effort to do the things that everybody screamed about for a long, long time. One of the things that over my lifetime that makes me frustrated is that we lots of times start out trying to do good. The legislature, I don't believe that people are in there just so they can do bad things. That isn't why they ran. And most of the information you get comes from your constituents. Somebody calls you, sees you, whatever, and so you're just sort of like a vacuum cleaner. You're sort of sucking up all this information, and then when you get a whole bunch of these things, you take some action on it. Even if your bill passes and it's signed into law, there's no guarantee that funding is going to effect the change that you want over the long haul. Things go away. Does anybody ever go back and say, gee, are we fully supporting the programs that we already have, whether they're at DCF or I know that at the Department of Agriculture they were often limited inspections. Okay, things that you would think at the time we had one chicken inspector for the entire state. Struck me as a little odd, but you know, who am I? Maybe there are more now.
So it's hard to give a sort of a simple response to that question. I think, you know, a number of things come to mind when I hear that. Of course, you know, how you define need is one of the issues. You know, some people say we need 2 inspectors. Some people think we need 8. It all, you know, it's not exactly an objective question there. I will say, you know, there's an ongoing, as part of the budget process, that's effectively what we do. You know, all of these departments kind of feed into that budget conversation to say, what do we need? Are we meeting our mission? Aren't we? And they have to really make the case for why they may or may not need additional resources, and that's kind of what we evaluate when we do the state budget. The other thing is, you know, for education in particular, you know, this is a big issue, obviously, in Massachusetts, and there was a bill filed and was actually executed around the foundation budget review, which is intended to do exactly that, is to say, you know, we did education reform back in 1993. A lot has changed since then. And if you just think about the technology requirements alone to implement or execute education, whether it be back office or with the students or what have you, just the cost of that alone and benefits significantly more than was originally contemplated.
Healthcare.
Healthcare, right. So that analysis was done to answer exactly the question that you're asking, which is, are we as a state contributing enough to education to meet today's needs? And the answer was no, not surprisingly. And there was a bill, there were a number of other recommendations about how that additional funding would be directed, one of which is benefits, as well as special education services. There was a bill that was filed and actually ended up getting a lot of debate, and we ran out of time at the end of the session. And it was in the news a significant amount. The House and Senate had sort of different views on how to move forward with that, and it stalled. But that is going to be coming up again this session and is probably one of the number one issues we're going to be working on. The other thing is the governor, when he first came in, the regulatory framework is something that always comes up as part of a concern. You know, do the regulations that we have in place really contribute in a meaningful way? Are they helpful? And are we spending money maybe on some things that are outdated or irrelevant? So he came in and in his team did a kind of an exhaustive evaluation of all of the regulations that were on the books. And a lot of them, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but a lot of them were cleared out, you know, as having been kind of legacy that no longer served a purpose. Some of them were modified in order to streamline them, you know, kind of looking at them big picture to make sure that they kind of fit together well and they aren't these isolated. So there has been a lot of work in that regard. But the funding challenges, you know, I think we have funding challenges at the state level. And a lot of things like DCF aren't fully funded.
So we've got children's education, foster children, transportation so that commuters can get to work, and we've got to protect the water, and we've got to get, wow, you know, there's just so much.
Elders, you know, seniors.
Yes, let's not forget us.
There. Yeah.
The us being me, not you. But
getting there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I hope you get there. You know, it's really a gift to get there, to be the elders.
That's right. But I will say, you know, to your point earlier about how, you know, how should people feed into the process, all of those decisions are made through the budget process.
Okay.
And the budget process is really a reflection of our values at the state level. So, you know, we take what we hear from constituents and we reflect those desires in the budget and how we choose to make those hard decisions about allocating money. knowing that, there are certain needs, but maybe if the public is telling us these needs are more important, that kind of is where the funding goes. And a great example of that is the Mass Cultural Council.
When they tried to take it out, yes.
That is one of those things that doesn't, when you talk about all the things that we focus on at the state level, that isn't necessarily something that first comes to people's minds. Right. But I will tell you that every time there is a budget amendment or a question about the Mass Cultural Council, which, as you know, provides local funding for the arts to each individual community, there is an outcry. I can't tell you, it's probably the top 3 sets of emails that I receive every budget session, because they're incredibly mobile, and the public is really interested in the arts.
It's personal. It's very personal.
And it's important. So that is reflected in the state budget. And I would say if people have other issues that are particularly important to them, please stay in touch and let me know. And our budget process is actually starting soon with our consensus revenue to establish the baseline revenue projections for next year. The governor will release his budget in January, and then the House will be doing our budget in April. So kind of the February, March, April timeframe would be a time to get that information to us. And all of the budget information is on the website, so malegislature.gov, and they can pull up the budget and see the governor's budget and kind of see our budget process as it moves forward.
Can't complain about not having the information. May not want to.
Well, it's just a lot.
It is
you need to know where to find it and how to get what you need when you want it is the challenge, but we're getting there.
Yeah, it's always just so much fun when I actually land on the thing that I'm looking for. It's like, woo-hoo. So back just now, you were talking about differences between the Senate and the House in terms of how they were looking at the educational budget, the education budget, and, sort of the vision of what education should be. What are the differences between the two bodies?
That's a good question.
Probably bigger than what we can cover in this show, but just sort of briefly.
I think that there's just, obviously the constituencies are different. We have, with 160 members in the House and 40 members in the Senate, we've just got more voices at the table to contribute locally. I think it's harder, more challenging for us in the House, but perhaps a more we get greater granularity in our debate as well. I think there's been some conversation about, funding and how we are going to fund this and the time frame that we're going to be allocating funding going forward. I know at this particular bill that we were talking about, there was some last-minute information that was obtained from the Department of Education, which I think there were different perspectives on how that new information would be evaluated and whether that was a critical piece of information to consider in moving the legislation forward. I think the Senate was a little more comfortable moving the legislation forward, and the House was a little less so. They wanted, some more time to really consider this new information, which suggested that maybe the allocation of funding in the current bill was not as refined as it might be, and it would be best to serve the public. So I think, philosophically, I think both branches are very much understand the need to move forward, but it's really the devil is in the details, and that's a lot of times where things get hung up.
No, for sure. Okay, another thing from your newsletter, robocalls. Are you really going to make them go away, please?
We have been trying.
Oh my God, has that gotten to be just a nightmare?
And I've been hearing about this for a long time, and unfortunately, the bottom line is that there's really very little at the state level that we can do. I mean, these are companies, big companies that have the power to put the technology in place. What has been happening is that folks like the AGs, so there's been a group of AGs across the state that are hearing about this, and they have sent multiple letters, one most recently within the last month or so, asking that these companies that can put kind of screening technology in place to allow people to have more control over what calls come in and what don't, that they really advance this technology on the private sector side, because there really isn't a whole lot we can do regulatorily, although we've been trying.
Well, it's just amazing now that you can get a phone call from somebody that you know, a familiar name with a local phone number, and find out it's a robocall.
Yeah, that's the spoofing.
I mean, that is just horrifying, just it's like, really?
well, unfortunately, they're always sort of one step ahead.
They are. And you block that one, and all they do is rotate to the next digit, and, you've got somebody else. So it's like, no, it's impossible to stay ahead. And lately, because I've been getting phone calls from care providers and so forth from all over the state with different area codes, and some of them 800 numbers, it's been impossible just to let it go. Normally, if I don't recognize it, I can't forget it. If they really want me, they'll call me back. But now I have to take them all, and at least a third of them are just not relevant. They're just junk mail, so to speak.
And now they're coming on cell phones somehow.
Well, this is all on my. This is on my cell phone.
Oh, really?
That's all on my cell phone because I very rarely use my house phone.
Well, the one thing that they say is don't answer the call. If you have any inclination, because as soon as you answer, then they identify that is a real phone, and they will
keep bugging you
more. Right?
Yeah. And usually that's my theory. But as I say, I've been forced to pick up strange phone numbers lately, and so I've had to do that. Tell me also about, there was, again, within your newsletter, the issue of dyslexia. I picked up on that one because I've been curious about that, how schools process kids that, might be, and how early do they do that? What is the situation with that particular?
So there is no screening for dyslexia in the schools, and it's a fairly easy screen from what I understand, so it's not really a cost issue. And it's a way to get services early to kids that have dyslexia. I mean, the reason why this legislation gained so much attention is because of the stories of people, had they been diagnosed earlier in the schools, and were there a consistent framework for evaluating early, services could be brought to bear earlier in the process, which, as I understand it, are fairly straightforward services. It's nothing kind of extraordinary. And there's a lot of dyslexia out there, and it really impacts learning in a way that causes material impacts if you don't address it early. So we passed legislation recently that would address that.
Yep.
And a long time coming, but actually got a message from my predecessor, Barbara Gardner, about that. That's something that she's still interested in from an education perspective, and recognizes the need for that. And there are a lot of moms, actually, a lot of parents that have been very engaged in this and reaching out and mobilizing to get this passed. And I'm finally, after a number of years, I'm glad we finally got it done.
You can, I mean, on the internet, you can actually get screened for dyslexia. It's that easy. I mean, it's not an elaborate process to be able to decipher it. So I can't think it would be all that expensive to add to the curriculum.
And that's one of the, the balancing acts. It's a perfect example of a balancing act we have. We recognize the schools have resource challenges, and they've got a lot of demands on the resources that they have. But there's also the learning piece, so you're kind of balancing an additional requirement with the cost and with the outcome educationally, which
But I would think
is
if
important.
You catch it early, then the cost that you would bear later in the experience, the growth
it would
experience,
be lesser
it'd be
cost
less
down
there. So I mean, it's easier to catch it in the beginning than it is to try to undo and relearn. So I would think it would offset one another and maybe even be just neutral. So I don't know. Anyway, okay, so now what have we not touched on that you want to touch on?
What have we not touched on? So, the climate issues, I think, are significant, and I think it's worth giving those a little more airtime.
Okay, happy to.
There have been a lot of local folks getting organized, especially here in Holliston. There's a very active group that has been engaging with me around what we can do around climate change and how can we impact. It really is a generational issue. I've had grandparents come to me and really say that they're concerned for the future of their grandparents and the kind of world that we're
leaving them
for them. And I think there's a sense of a little bit of helplessness. That people see these reports and they think, well, what can I do locally? And that is not lost to us at the state level. And there's we've got the Global Warming Solutions Act, which set in place benchmarks that we need to meet from an environmental perspective. And we're really looking at ways that we can do that. We've been focusing a lot on energy. So solar, obviously, we've got a new SMART program that's intended to kind of organize the incentives that we give at the state level in a different way to make them hopefully more sustainable over the long term. But I'd like to see us looking more at, other ways that we can address this issue. Things like the transportation issue can make a big difference. Also, there's a focus on local, so municipal. What can municipalities do to prepare for these climate impacts? And there's a new municipal vulnerabilities preparedness program that was put in place in 2017 that provides grants to municipalities for local projects that they want to implement in order to address some of these climate impacts. So that's something that our municipalities should be watching for. And I think we all need to kind of be thinking about what we can do to limit these climate impacts. So if we can take public transit instead of taking your car, if you can use the rail trail, instead of taking your car downtown, if you could take your bike or walk downtown, let's choose that option as well. And rail trails, that's something that has been a wonderful boon for us here in Holliston. Had state support in getting that to happen, and there's ongoing conversations about how we can expand rail trails as not only a resource for places like Holliston, but also regionally. How can we connect the big loop? So getting those portions of trail in Sherburne and Framingham and Hopkinton so that we can, really start to move around the region and maybe take our cars less. That's something that we pay attention to.
The idea of getting us connected to Framingham by the trail, I mean, think about it. It's right to the trains. That's where it goes. I mean, great asset that would be if you lived, within bike distance of the trail. You could get yourself. Otherwise, we'd need a parking lot big enough to. And then we'd have an issue, wouldn't we? We'd have a parking issue with people bringing their bikes to the trail, and then where would we park their cars? And all of that needs to be considered.
Well, and one of the things that's come out of this transit conversation is the need to look at door-to-door. So instead of looking at transit and the train and thinking about that in isolation, right, it's, we need to think about the customer experience. And we think about, from the moment that you need to leave your door to get to work in the morning, what are those legs of the journey and how can we improve that? And the perfect example there is, we've got a very heavy train. The 508 train in the morning going into Boston is packed. Standing room only, and there have been a lot of concerns about overcrowding. Well, if you look at the parking fills up basically right at the time that 508 train comes. So even if you could take a later train, you wouldn't be able to park. So you would, you'd either have to take the earlier train or you have to go on the Pike. So parking very much needs, if we're going to be talking about transit, we need to be talking about parking and making sure that all of those elements are connected, which seems straightforward. In practice, it's harder to achieve, and it hasn't been really thought of that way in the past. So that's one of the things we're starting to talk about is how to do that.
I remember one time when Carl Damagella and I were on the board at the same time. I don't remember what years, but there's a space behind what used to be the Bay Bank and is now Kamala. There's like a big acreage back there between that house and the next one. And he talked about putting in underground parking. He also talked about it down in the center of town too. And it was like, nobody gave it any thought. But as time goes on, you think about it, it's like, I wonder if there's a way to do that closer to the rail trail. Is there some parcel along there that, who knows? But no idea should get tossed out until you've actually looked at it.
And it's a challenge for downtown. I've heard from local businesses about the concerns with parking. And one of the things I did in the last bond bill was to add some funding for parking for downtown. So if there is a project that folks want to move forward with, there'll at least be an opportunity to use some of that funding to do that.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I know the selectmen are talking about, Green Street. There are some people who would like to see the town buy it and tear down the 9 Green Street and create parking there. Others who say, here it is a commercial property, you can expand the tax base. I mean, there's a perfect example of, you need both. You need both, and how do you have both? Underground parking maybe. I think that's actually underneath that building is where the old bowling alleys were, so it might just be possible. Who knows? I never bowled there, but I know I've talked to people who have. So, wow.
The other point, you mentioned things to talk about. I don't think you could not talk about healthcare, because healthcare is something that's really, the cost of healthcare in particular, is something that is a concern to everyone. I was at a hearing yesterday. I'm on the Telecommunications, Utilities, and Energy Committee, and we had the hearing on the National Grid lockout yesterday. And if there were ever an example of underscoring the importance of health insurance and health care, some of the stories that came out of that hearing about folks, because of course some of these workers lost their health insurance when they were locked out, and some of the stories were pretty moving and really left you thinking, this is so incredibly important to people's daily lives. And the cost of health care is challenging, and it's a constant effort at the state level to kind of keep chipping away at how can we, knowing that this enormous system, you have to be careful about unintended consequences, but how can we keep chipping away at this cost issue? And the issue that keeps coming up now is the cost of pharmaceuticals. And how can we control costs there? And one of the things that I expect will be coming up this session is looking at more transparency for the cost of pharmacy. And there are different, prices for different how to control prices in a way, with the generics, and it's a very complicated formula, but how can we really make sure that people have access to the drugs that they need at a reasonable cost? And transparency is kind of the beginning of that conversation.
Are you folks talking about the role that China plays in that whole conversation? Because there was a whole big NPR thing this last week. I don't know if it's based on a book. I can't remember if it was based on a book. I think so. But somebody wrote about the fact that China pays cartels to be created, pharmaceutical cartels within their country, and then they control the pricing of meaning the government gets to control the pricing within that cartel. So whatever pharmaceutical it was left the United States to be processed in China because it was cheaper, less expensive to do that there, and with the idea that it would become more accessible, financially accessible for people in the United States. But when it got over into China and within this cartel system, the cost actually went up 700%. But there's no control because none of it's happening on our premises, So there is an offshore component that I think you might want to, look at, that where you just don't have that kind of control, and what do you do? What do you do?
Yeah, and I think the beginning is part of the challenge is that it's a lot of this information about costs and things is not available.
Yeah.
And a lot of it's proprietary, so it makes having a conversation about how best to address the problem. If you can't really define the problem or figure out what part of the supply chain, so to speak, is where the cost is incurred, you can't really address it legislatively.
Yeah.
So that's why, and obviously we've got a large biotech industry here in Massachusetts that we need to be kind of cognizant of how this affects them and how this affects jobs. But the transparency piece, again, before kind of coming in and making assumptions about solutions, we really want to understand the lay of the land first to use a scalpel, and not a machete when it comes to addressing the concern. So it's an iterative process, and this healthcare conversation has been going on for a very, very long time, and I think it probably won't end anytime soon. It's going to be an ongoing, just keep coming back at it to try and control the cost and increase accessibility.
Can we double back to a question that I asked earlier and then I forgot to follow up on, and that was about whether or not there were educational materials about the whole clean air, clean water, clean, environmental things. Are there any materials through the state that you can think of?
There are some. The one that immediately comes to mind is a new program around stormwater, which is, I think, the context in which this came up.
Yeah.
So there's a stormwater coalition in the greater Worcester area that has come up, worked with DEP at the state level to come up with a series of educational materials, and I believe they're called Think Blue is the name of the campaign. And the idea is to make these materials available to cities and towns to put in their water bills, for example. That starts to get the word out to people about why it affects them and why it's important.
I don't know if you've caught, but on some Facebook page, there are a few people who are trying to create some interest in homeowners becoming more aware about what they're using on their lawns and with trees and plants and other blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so they're trying to come up with a name and try to create something of a little organization within town.
That's locally?
Yep, strictly Holliston, but Healthy Homes Healthy Homes, Healthy Holliston, Holliston's Healthy Homes, something like that. But basically to get the idea that Holliston can't be healthy if the homes aren't healthy. And so, you've got to look at the environment of each house individually and what people are doing with their water, their trash, their recycling, their pesticides and paints and so forth.
And the state does have access to, a lot of resources perhaps that are available locally, so I would hope folks like that would reach out, and I can certainly facilitate them getting what information is available.
And I think our town administrator, Jeff Ritter, has done a really good job in terms of trying to get more of the the energy efficiency, the cars, and looking at alternatives, and now looking at solar up at the landfill and all that kind of thing. So, I think the town itself is doing well.
And there's a new recycling
there's
website that the state just put together.
And we're linked to it. Holliston is linked to it, trying to explain who knew how complicated it was to
know what to recycle.
Oh, my good grief. I'm
Yeah.
looking at these things and thinking, wow, I always thought that was recyclable. Look at that. It's not.
Yeah.
There's really, it's amazing how much of it's not when I look at what my barrels look like. It's like, wow. So,
and you really need to, of all the things you need to know things about, there's a lot of detail to it. You need to be educated.
Seriously. And you can't, there's another thing is that website points out that you can't count on the fact it's going to have the little triangle with the recycling emblem on it. Don't rely on that, because it doesn't necessarily factor in anymore.
Yeah.
So you have to know. It's kind of, you got to walk around with your little checklist on trash day. Yes, it's okay.
Hopefully there'll be a technology for that soon, right?
We'll gotta hope,
solve
but
the
anyway.
problem.
All right. Well, when we see each other 3 months from now, we'll be in the throes of, actually, it'll be getting to be maybe closer to spring.
Budget.
It will be closer to spring, to the budget. That's good. It'll also be Holliston's budget. It'll also be Holliston's period of time in which we may have campaigns going on and stuff like that too. So there may be some local government stuff that'll be of interest too. So
that's great.
All right,
Mary, it was great to be here.
Yeah, you too. And you get sworn in on January 2nd, 3rd, somewhere thereabouts.
2nd, yep.
Yeah, good. And enjoy your day. It's probably not quite the euphoria it was the first day, but
no. But we've got a big new incoming class. A lot of women coming in to our legislator, more than have been in the past, so that's exciting for us as the Women's Caucus.
Yeah. Any leadership conversations in there? Anything changing?
Oh, I'm sure there'll be a lot of changes because there've been a lot of turnover.
People left,
right?
Or lost.
So there'll be a lot of kind of shuffling of the deck chairs, so to speak, for leadership. And it's amazing the number of people that have turned over, even in the amount of, even just in the time that I've been in office. A colleague was telling me yesterday who came in the session after me, saying that since he'd come in, 60% of the legislature had turned over already, and that would be in 8 years, which
that's actually,
I think, more than people would think.
Yeah, I was going to say that's more than you would think. And so when we start screaming about term limits, that maybe there are
the reality
more limits.
is right. It turns over, I think, much more than people think it does,
and I think maybe more than it used to. I think in the good old days there weren't that many that turned over, but it was a very different day. The demands were very different. So anyway, well, have a good holiday season. Your family going to be all together?
We will be.
Good.
We'll be hosting this year.
Nice.
So
that's fun.
got to get in the kitchen and get.
You got to remember how to cook now.
And clean the house. Yeah.
Clean the house. Yoo-hoo! All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us again, and to all our viewers, thank you. And remember, stay in touch with Carolyn's office if there are things of concern and of interest. It really makes a huge, huge difference. And people, oftentimes I'll hear them say, oh, it just doesn't matter if I... No, quite the opposite. If you yourself contact by mail or less so by email, email's getting to be but still email's better than no mail or a phone call. It does matter. They do listen. So anyway, take that as a piece of advice from somebody who used to have to answer those calls. Anyway, all right, take care. We'll see you next time.